All right, this is the follow up, and we are following up today on on two videos I did in November 2020 entitled The Silent Majority and Silent No More. My guest today on the follow up is the great Javier Diaz. What's going on, Javier? Welcome to the follow up.
What's up, George? Thank you. Thank you.
My pleasure, man. So, for those who don't know, let me give you a little bit of a background. Javier is one of my colleagues at the Broadway show Ain't Too Proud. He's one of the two percussion players, together with the great Roger Squitero. They hold down the rhythm for all of us. They are an essential element to the way that band sounds. And I am so thrilled to be playing with both of them night after night. It's been nothing but a pleasure. What Javier's involvement in today's follow-up video is concerned, I asked him to come up and give a little bit of a rundown on percussion instruments, because it is my understanding that there are a number of Native American percussion instruments or percussion instruments that have roots in Native American culture that have influenced how we hear music and how they show up in all of this pop music, R&B, jazz, call it what you will, in everything that we listen to today. So, since I know of Javier and I know that he studied a lot of percussion instruments, I thought he was the perfect person to ask these questions and sort of perhaps give a little bit of a demonstration of what the instruments actually are. So, Javier, let's get into it right away. Native American culture is sort of our basis. That's where we start from, right? So
Yeah.
there are a number of instruments that I believe that come from that culture and that have made their way into the music that we hear today, into a collective consciousness. What's your take on that?
Well, first of all, George, thanks for inviting me on
Of course.
this, to this series. I mean, this is great, and I'm glad to have a platform to talk about these issues and these instruments and influences. I want to just clarify that when we say Native American, we're using that as an umbrella term to indicate we're using the word America
Hmm.
as the vast continent of
Yes.
America, all the way from Alaska
All the
to
way down.
Patagonia,
Yes. Yes.
the Caribbean islands, and so on and so forth, Central America, and all that. I was talking to my daughter recently, and we got into this whole thing how in the United States they teach America as a continent, and they
Right.
have all these different words to
Right.
describe America as a continent. And of course, we use Americans as the people from the United States and Native Americans as the original people from North America. But
Right.
we are going to use Native Americans as the original people in all of the Americas and the Caribbean islands.
Yes, 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 yes. Very,
That's
very
going to be
important. Yeah, very
paramount
important
for our
distinction.
discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
I am originally from Cuba,
Yeah.
and in Cuba, in the popular culture, what you hear all the time is that native Cubans and people from the Caribbean islands disappeared and were killed or died off
Hmm.
early in the process of the
Colonization.
conquest of
Right.
the Spaniards, which
Right.
was a brutal process
Right.
of cultural transformation, genocide, and slavery, and everything in between. Uh, so, you grow up in Cuba with this idea, but there are elements of
Hmm.
these native Cuban, native Caribbean cultures that start permeating, and you start noticing them, and you
Right.
start seeing things, and finding words that we use in Spanish. And
Yeah.
it's an interesting thing, like the Spanish, they adopted words that the original people from the Caribbean islands used, incorporated it into Spanish,
Mm.
and took it to other parts of the Americas
Mm.
as if those were Spanish words.
That's
So
crazy.
Native Americans from other parts of the Americas,
Hmm.
they started using words as canoe and maize or
Right.
maize,
Right.
for corn,
Right.
and those were Taino words, as far as I know, that were used in the Caribbean. So
Right. Right.
in Cuba, Puerto Rico, the island of also known as Borinquen, and Haiti,
Right.
and those islands, the people that lived there were Tainos.
Right.
In Cuba, there were also Siboneyes, there
Yeah.
were also Guanatabeyes. These were the cultures, but the Tainos were one of the largest cultures there. And we know of this because the Spanish were like, the
Yeah.
chronicles.
Yeah, yeah, all of that, the whole Taino culture is very, very well documented by Spanish colonization efforts, conquistadors, and all of that. It's very interesting that you bring up the Tainos because in the video "Silent No More," I pinpoint to an Instagram account who actually I forgot the guy's name like right now, Baron something or another. I think it's Baron Claiborne, but I'm not 100%. Anyway, he showed the original. He made like a whole series of posts of original pictures depicting the Taino culture when the conquistadors arrived at the
Wow.
shores, right?
Wow.
And interestingly enough, they were all black.
Mm.
They were all like this. There's none of the light skin or the however however the depiction has changed over the years. They
Right.
were
They were
straight.
very dark skinned.
It was straight up black. There was just no like curly hair. Straight up black. There's just no two ways about that. Very very interesting. But please continue. This just a side note.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of hard to know what exactly, like these Spaniards, they were seeing these cultures for the first time. Who knows what they were really seeing?
Yeah.
Like your eyes are
Yeah. Yeah.
seeing
Yeah.
something, but your mind is seeing something else.
Yeah.
And then when you depict those things, it's kind of hard to know exactly who these
What's what?
Taínos were.
Right.
But we do have DNA.
Exactly.
And, I was very surprised to find out that in my DNA, when, you do those like
The
whatever,
taste.
the
Yeah.
test,
Yeah.
the genealogical test, there was a considerable amount of native Cuban DNA in my genetic makeup, and I was like, wait a minute, I thought like they keep telling us that these people disappeared 500 years ago.
Right.
So how come there's that DNA? And it turns out that it things weren't
As
as
cut and dry
cut and
as.
dry. Like for instance, the Spaniards, they changed, like in Puerto Rico. I just recently found out that they changed in one of the census that they did in the 19th century.
Mm,
They changed the category, like racial category, and they
mm.
put this racial category called pardos, which just basically means brown people, pardos. And because they didn't want to use
Right.
Indios, which is
Right.
what the Spaniards call the native people from all of those islands and
Right.
from the Americas.
Right.
So you want like, well, now in the Pardos, all of a sudden you're going to have native Puerto Ricans, you're going to have uh, people of mixed race between
Right.
African and
Right.
native Puerto Ricans, and then you're going to have some European blood in there as well. So you're going to have all this mixture of people that come from all these different places with different degrees of membership to whatever cultures.
Right.
And now all of a sudden they're pardos according to this census. And I wish I had the year. I can't remember the year, but this was in the 19th century.
Right.
But anyway, so what I want to say is that I have found out through my life as a musician that the influence of at least the idea of native people from the Caribbean islands
Mm-hmm.
has been fundamental in the
Right.
formation of nationhood and the idea of a culture
Yeah.
that is more or less amplified by music and arts and all of that stuff.
Yeah.
So, you got names like Atue, which was the name of a chief
Mm.
that came from what is now today Dominican Republic,
Yeah.
went to Cuba to warn
Mm.
the Cubans of the Spaniards.
Crazy.
He's like, listen, these cats came from Spain. They're killing everybody. It's horrible. Don't trade with these guys. Well, eventually the Spaniards came and caught
Yeah.
this chief
Yeah.
Atway, and they killed him. They burned him.
Right.
And the history, what the chronicles register was like the priest came to like try to say, hey, you want to go to heaven? We can make you go to heaven before we burn you alive, right? And he's like, wait a minute. So
Wait a second.
are there gonna be Spanish people in heaven? And the priest was like, well, of course. And he said, well, in that case, I don't want to go. So that was in the chronicles, that was covered by. So that image of a race of people that were resisting conquest
Exactly.
from the very beginning
Exactly. Yeah.
was fundamental for like the formation of Cuba as an independent nation, for
Right.
example. So
Right.
here
Right.
is an icon taken from history or from the stories that
Yeah.
people chronicle, and that became part of the Cuban identity. Uh, in Puerto Rico and Dominican Republic and other parts of the Caribbean, there are similar accounts of this
Yeah.
stuff. You have like this chief, the female chief, her name was a princess, her name was Anacaona.
Mm.
Anacaona, she was honored by the Fania All Stars Orchestra, with songs that talk about her, and other groups as well. There are like people like Ernesto Lecuona, the Cuban composer,
Mm.
writing the famous song Siboney,
Yeah.
which is about like this mythical
Mm.
uh, person that is supposed to be a Siboney
Right.
Indian.
Right.
Now, of course, there's a lot of like mythology, exoticizing of what these native people were and who they were,
Yeah.
but nonetheless, the elements like words, all kinds of dishes and
Yeah.
things like that, from tamales to pasteles
Yeah.
to yuca,
Yeah.
which is the cassava. I mean, like, what do we have in Cuba on the New Year's Eve? We have congri, which is, they call it here the moros, right? Where
Right. Right.
arroz with beans,
Right.
rice, beans cooked together,
Right.
and then you have pork
Yeah.
and you have yuca. So
There you
you
go.
gotta have the yuca in there with the mojo on top, the sauce,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
because
Yeah.
otherwise the plate is not complete, and that's like a traditional thing. And then we have other things like the ajiaco, which is a soup with
Right.
all these root vegetables. Hey, guess what? Those root vegetables did not exist in Spain,
Right.
you know.
Right.
And
Right.
and of course, there's also an African influence, huge,
Yeah. Yeah.
because that's what happened in Cuba and in most of the Caribbean. They started importing people,
Mm-hmm.
bringing them, enslaving them from West and Central Africa, bringing them to these islands.
Yeah.
And what happens? Their culture also comes with them.
Of course.
Their religion, their music, their language.
Plus, there is, as you already pointed out, like this particular story, be it Native American, African, like it gets really difficult to distinguish. Like, where does the Native American, meaning all Americas, where does the African influence, where do those two kind of, where does one stop and the other one start? That's one thing. But my point also is that the entire story is a story of resistance. Let's
A
make no
hundred percent.
100%. So
Even
without,
if people are getting married,
there you go. Yes,
even if like a Spaniard is marrying somebody with name, even in that supposed union, there
yeah,
is resistance.
exactly, exactly. Because there's one group of people that denies the humanity of another group of people, and that particular group of people says, we're not having any of that. No, we're fighting back.
Right,
So
and it's
that
also the matter of the power, so there's like, okay, like through religion, through politics, through military might, and I mean guns, germs, and steel, right?
yeah,
um, you get all of these things that start dominating the culture
yeah.
in the Americas, right? But
And yet at the same time, you have the cultural influence that pervades, that persists. You have
yeah,
like the names, you have the food, you have the stories, and
yeah, well,
then
there's also spirituality. Like for instance, and
there you
going
go.
to talk about, like, if we're talking about Cuba, we got to talk about Cuban religions, right? And Cuban
Of course.
religions go from straight up Catholicism to like straight up African spirituality and everything in between. And
Right.
guess what? In both uh, popular versions of Christian religion and popular versions of African spirituality, there are elements
Mm.
that come from Native American ways of being spiritual and worshiping. Even in Brazil,
Yeah.
you go to Brazil where they have candomblé and they have other types of, religions that of African origin. They have incorporated all sorts of native Brazilian elements,
Mm-hmm.
from spirits that may come and visit them and bring
Yeah.
messages and whatnot. And the same thing goes for many parts of the Caribbean.
Yeah.
And besides all of these, spiritual elements and cultural references in languages, places,
Mm-hmm.
names, and histories, you also have music. You also
Yeah.
have instruments. In my specialty of percussion,
Of
we
course.
have several percussion instruments, and that come straight up from those native cultures in the Caribbean.
Now,
um
I already know, and the people listening, people watching don't know that, of course, but I know that Javier has brought a bunch of instruments. so,
well, I brought a few. uh, but And we know this because, again, the Spaniards were writing down what they were
Mm,
seeing, and they were
exactly.
describing some of these instruments.
Right. Right.
There was a dance that the native Cubans did called areito.
Mm-hmm.
And this dance was also in other islands in the Caribbean. That whole area of the Caribbean islands, right?
Mm,
The Antilles and so on and so forth, was populated by different ethnic groups that were more or less related to the general description of Arawaks.
okay.
Came from the mainland in South America and little by little started going up the chain of islands
Right.
and populating the whole region. So they could all go from one island to another and understand each other, even though the languages
There
were
were
not
differences.
exactly
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
same. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there was a general cultural thing. So you're going to find all of these instruments I'm going to show you. You're going to find them in different versions
Mm,
of all of these islands.
mm,
And we have them today and we use them in different kinds of music.
yeah.
So the first one I want to show you is an instrument that is super used in Latin music, so-called Latin music, which is the guiro.
Right.
You
Right.
see, and the guiro is a gourd,
Yeah.
right? In
Yeah.
fact, the word guiro, okay,
Means
it's a native
there you go.
word describing this particular
Plant.
thing, this
Yeah.
gourd,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So guiro comes from that. And it's got little indentations here, and you play it with the stick, and
Right.
it makes this sound, right? I'm sure you've heard this.
Oh yeah.
Oye, como va
Yeah. There you go.
mi ritmo. Okay, so this quintessential pattern, right, in cha cha cha
Mm-hmm.
and in other types of Cuban Latin music, it's the guido is holding it together. As a
Right.
matter of fact, the Cuban orchestra, Los Van Van,
Mm-hmm.
I've heard that they have a full time dedicated guido player. Okay. And he is super important in the orchestra. Like, he's gotta like be in his zone. He's got to be relaxed. He's going to play all night long. The
Yeah,
arms got to be, you
yeah,
know, and this is like quintessential,
yeah.
to the sound of that type of sound, like Los Bambam being a charanga
And
type of.
it's it's not only like Cuban popular music, like it just and we'll get into that like with all the other instruments as well. But just imagine 70s rock without the guiro.
No,
Doesn't
forget about it.
exist. It doesn't
No, no, no.
exist. It doesn't like all the stuff that was recorded at Criteria Studios or that was recorded on the West Coast, like you name it, it shows up everywhere, right?
Right, right. Yeah, and I want to say real quick that there are other versions of the guiro
Yeah.
that are not made out of a gourd. For example, you have this. This is made out of metal, right?
Okay.
In Cuba, this instrument is called the guayo,
Guayo. Okay.
another native
Name.
name.
The-
And the guayo, of course, not cylindrical like this, but a little bit square.
mhm.
It was used to grind the yuca,
Well, there you
the
go.
cassava, and with that, when you and also the corn, el
Yeah.
maíz,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So the yuca, the dry yuca, you do that to make the cassava bread,
Yeah.
which was the bread that which is still people eat in
Today.
Eastern Cuba
Yeah.
today.
Yeah.
And when I lived in Venezuela, I mean the cassava was cassava. They call it cassava. Is everywhere,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And also in the Dominican Republic. In the Dominican Republic, this is called guira, right? And the guira is like the voice of, together with the tambora, which is the drum, is the voice of merengue.
Mm.
Without this, without that,
Yeah.
there's no merengue.
Right.
I don't know if a single merengue. I might be wrong about this, but I've never heard of a merengue that doesn't have a guira.
Exactly.
Okay. So, and even Motown, man, you listen to like some Temptation records, you hear the Guido, you
Yeah.
hear like
Yeah.
all of this stuff, and it just, you forget where it comes from. You think, oh, it's Latin music. Okay, yeah, but Latin music is not one thing, it's many things.
Right, right, right. And I mean, the term Latin music sort of, brings it back to Europe, and that is totally misleading. That's the
100%.
it doesn't like I've in the last couple maybe 10, 15 years, like I had to relearn calling everything Afro-Cuban, calling it
Right, right,
Afro-Caribbean,
right.
because that is the
More
correct.
descriptive, more exact.
Exactly. That's more descriptive, more exact. That is the correct way of naming stuff. Latin music, of course, there are Latin music Grammys and all of that shit. You're
Right,
not
right,
going to, we're not going to change everybody's mind like that. It's not going to
right,
happen.
right.
Nevertheless, it is important to at least get the ball rolling. What the idea is concerned, that this is Latin is misleading. That's
Well,
just
it's
not what
funny,
it
man.
is.
I always laugh when, like, when it's like the Latin Grammys time, and you see like a lot of like, our brothers from Spain, right? They
Right.
come, they collect the Latin Grammys, and they go back to Europe. But the rest of the time, they're not
They're not
Latinos.
here. Yeah.
They're not Latinos. They're, only Latino when there is a Latin Grammy. But it's cool. It's cool. I mean, look, man. We all come from different places. And it's all a big mixture in the end. But
Right.
we gotta give credit
Where
where
credit is due. Yeah.
credit is due. So
Right.
I gotta say that, I actually, you know what? Let me show you another instrument that you're gonna be like, wow, this
Right.
is also from the native Caribbean cultures of the Taínos, the
Right.
Siboneyes, and so
Right.
on and so forth. And it is
The
the
maracas.
maracas,
There you go.
right? Remember the Rolling Stones, right?
Oh
The
yeah.
maracas.
Yeah. I mean, it goes further. It goes even back further to Bo Diddley. Bo Diddley and his
That's right.
recordings at Sun Records. His rhythm section consisted of him playing guitar, maybe a second guitar player, usually a bass player, and then one person dedicated to playing maracas.
Yeah.
No drums, but maracas, right?
Maracas.
And
Wow, that's
Bo
heavy.
Diddley is one of the architects of rock and roll. So
Yeah.
the stuff that the Rolling Stones listened to in order to get in order to be inspired to do their thing, Bo Diddley is one of them, right? So
Yeah.
he had the maracas. They were an entity. Maracas as such were an entity to him. He knew that sound. However, of course, I don't have any exact documentation of that, but he must have known that sound. He must have heard something in that sound
Yeah.
that clicked with him, and
Yeah.
all of a sudden he made that part of his sound, and his sound went all over the planet
Right.
and influenced everybody. Okay,
Yeah.
so the reach of these instruments is huge, and with these instruments, the reach of that culture is enormous. It
Oh
cannot
yeah. You
cannot
can't
be
deny
denied.
that.
Yeah.
You can't deny it. And I want to add that the maracas that the Spaniards described that the native people in the Caribbean use
Mm.
were a little bit larger,
Okay.
and they didn't necessarily use them in pairs,
Okay.
but they
Okay.
had like one maraca like that, and
Right.
it would be like going like that, right? I mean, if you hear that right away, you're like, okay, spirits time. You know what I'm saying?
Oh yeah.
So in
I,
Santeria, they use these instruments called acheres,
mm-hmm.
which are always some sort of maraca, right?
Right.
To summon the orisha, to talk to the orisha, you'll be like playing the achere, and it's always some sort of maraca.
Right.
In bomba, which
Right.
is like one of the national dances and types of music from Puerto Rico,
Right.
I mean, this is some killer drumming, like
Yeah.
killer, huge influence from Africa, like,
Mm.
like the
Mm.
dance and everything. And then they got one big maraca going like that, like saying, hey, we're still here. You know
Yes.
what I mean?
Yeah.
We're still
Yeah.
here. We know this is African music. We know like some of the lyrics are in Spanish. Your dance is clearly African. But
Yeah.
we
But
got
we're still
this
here.
spirit summoner thing here from the
Right.
Taino culture.
Right.
This maraca. So it's fascinating.
Yeah, 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 yeah. No, absolutely. It is fascinating to hear that from you. It is so great to be reminded of the fact that all of this culture is incredibly connected, right? It's incredibly
Yeah, it's
connected.
like you said. It's hard to know, like especially as let's say like enslaved people ran away and
Right,
found communities,
right,
outside of the cities and all that, and mingle with
right,
these native people.
right.
New things were born out of these
Yeah,
cooperations and
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah,
histories
yeah.
and all kinds of stuff.
I mean, there's a good amount of documentation actually that says that before Christopher Columbus there was several African royalties that managed to come all the way over to the Americas, right?
Yeah, I've
There's
heard that.
one king by the name of, and I'm totally mispronouncing his name, Mansa something. It you can it, everybody's watching who's listening in on this can look it up themselves. I don't I always make the disclaimer, I'm not a historian, but a lot of this makes a
Yeah, well,
lot of
neither
sense
am
to
I.
me.
Neither am I.
There you
I
go.
know a lot of stories, but I'm not.
Exactly, but read before the Mayflower, read up on all of that stuff, but the discovery of the Americas by African chiefs, monarchs, predates Christopher Columbus by many hundred years, right? So there's he actually Christopher Columbus, and this is one thing that I read today about in an article. When he left the West African, or when he left the West African European zone, so to speak, he wrote down that there was different ships from Guinea that passed him on the way in the same direction, that passed him by
No way! Wow,
Yes,
that
I mean,
you never hear. That's crazy. You never hear that, right?
you don't hear that. You don't hear that, but that's the other side of history. Like that's all of this stuff. That's why I'm saying like it's
Well,
very
just like you
difficult.
don't hear about the influence of the music made in
Right.
the Caribbean and in the Americas, traveling back to Europe
Yeah.
and
Exactly.
revolutionizing dance and music in
Yeah.
Europe, like
Yeah.
in the 16th century. You never hear this,
Right.
and these are histories. Speaking of historians,
Yeah.
all of those historians out there, these are histories waiting to be written, waiting to
Right.
be, taken
Intro-
care of.
introduced, yeah, introduced
Yeah.
to a lot of people. It's very, very important that a clear understanding of all of that is sort of, and I believe is making its way into a collective consciousness, right? There are, for instance, and then so let me just because there's a lot to that goes on at the same time when it comes to this subject. So on the one hand, you have the influence, the West African or African influence from the very beginning, right?
Hmm.
And then you have, of course, the influence of enslaved people who all, while they were enslaved, were fighting against the colonizers, fighting against the enslavement, fighting, resisting. That all of that history never gets mentioned, right? It's always like, well, they were enslaved and they kind of gave up. That's not true.
Hmm.
There is no way that is just not true, and there are
No, it
many.
was years and years of rebellions and
Exactly,
like and
exactly. I mean, it goes
resistance.
all the way to the independence of
Mm,
Haiti, right? I mean, that is the last, and that kind of spurred, and that is interestingly enough, that is one thing that we learned in Europe. That spurred the French Revolution. That spurred the American Revolution. Like all of
mm,
that. First, it
mm,
was Haiti
mm,
who rebelled against being a colony, right?
mm.
Time
Yeah,
the timeline is correct. That is absolutely correct. So what I'm saying is that
and from the beginning, I mean, like there were huge like resistance to the idea of having like
of
an
being in
independent nation
yeah, yeah,
in the Caribbean there, and especially one run by black people.
there you
I
go.
mean, from the get go, I mean, and it's, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like since then it's been like a de facto constant like
It's been a
uh,
constant fight.
fight,
Yeah,
for like just taking
it,
them out, legitimizing their effort, and so on and so forth. And
absolutely.
meanwhile, I mean, there's all kinds of other nations that gained their independence later
Right, right.
that haven't been subjected to that kind of
Y-
uh,
Um,
repression,
yeah,
if you will,
exactly,
Um,
exactly.
but let me just before we abandon the maracas, I
Yes,
want to also show you a different kind of this.
please do.
Like these maracas are more used in salsa,
Right.
in mambo, that kind of song, that kind of
Yeah.
music. And then these are Venezuelan maracas,
Mm.
which are these they have this type of gourd.
Mm-hmm.
These gourds are called in Venezuela. They call them tapara,
Right.
tapara, which again that's not a Spanish word. And and it's funny like because they got these seats inside and they play this kind of music, right, that it's called joropo, and they have many different kinds of music, and I'm not an expert in Venezuelan music, but
Right.
one of the rhythms, this, what that kind of playing is so virtuosic and it's
Yeah.
so prevalent in that kind of music like joropo,
Yeah.
and you find it also in Colombia.
Yeah.
And that's a national type of music
Yeah.
for Venezuelan people. Like if like maracas, this is like one of the national instruments. It's like this maracas de cuatro, which is a
Right.
four-string instrument,
Right.
very similar to the Spanish vihuela,
Right.
and a harp. And
You
with
know,
those
it's
three things, boom, done.
there you have it. I posted something on the base chat group site, um, by, I believe, either a Venezuelan group or a Colombian group, where they play exactly that kind of music. And they had a lady playing those maracas that you just held. She was playing those maracas and going to town on it. Like
Yeah.
there was no two ways about that. Like the lady was
Oh
working
yeah,
it.
no, this thing is that instrument is heavy.
Yeah.
Forget it.
Yeah. And the instrumentation included a cuatro and
Hmm.
included a harp player.
Yeah,
So that's exactly what you're talking about. So
yeah,
that's and that it totally blew me away because it was nothing but virtuosity. And at the same time, a dance, it had like a whole movement to it. It was really, you don't necessarily hear that all the time, or that
yeah.
often.
It's funny. This kind of music, when it's becoming more popular outside of those regions,
Right,
it's been becoming more popular, and that with that music is fascinating because you have the maracas, right,
right,
which
right,
are a native element
right,
of that region,
right.
and then you have the application of the rhythm in 3/4.
Yeah,
It's more of an African type of rhythmic
and
sensibility, but then you have the Spanish influence on the chord progressions and the string instruments, and
right,
because they also have bandolas and things like
right,
that. And but the result is like, okay, I mean, the lyrics are in Spanish. The types of music that they adopted from Spain,
right.
kind of like fandangos and jotas and things like that. And then they brought that to that region and then developed this whole new thing with
Mm.
these native elements and elements from African music. And then you get this new thing.
Yeah, yeah,
It's just
exactly.
unique.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
fascinating.
Exactly. And so this, what I'm trying to do with these videos and with this, I mean, I'm not much of an educator or anything, but this is stuff that's near to me because like my great grandmothers were Native Americans. It's something that I always grew up with, like knowing that we have family on Indian reservations, be it in the Southwest in Arizona, or be it in the Midwest in Iowa. Um, it is important to sort of just shine a light on it, and sorry, and be aware where this music is coming from, where this culture is coming from. Otherwise, you kind of losing a sense of authenticity. You're losing a sense of also knowing what exactly are you expressing when you're playing maracas. I mean,
Mhm.
you don't have to be like super educated about it, but you have to know where the hell it's coming from. Like we
Yeah.
know,
At
you
least you
know
got to honor its origin. You got to honor
exactly,
its,
exactly. We know people know the exact history of the fucking violin. Not to rag on violin players.
string by string.
String by string, exactly. you know, but at the same time, you have instruments that are way older, right? And cultures that
Way
are
older. Way older. Yeah.
many, many centuries older than the European culture. And for whatever reason, we're not supposed to talk about that, or we're not even. It doesn't even enter our consciousness yet. If you take a look at who's influenced by, say, a Bo Diddley, who's
Mm,
influenced, who did the Rolling Stones listen to, and why the hell is In Sympathy for the Devil is Mick Jagger standing there with two maracas. There's a
mm,
reason for that.
mm,
There's a
mm.
reason for that. I mean, look at the show we're doing, right? We got.
Well, forgive me for
Yeah,
interrupting. I
yeah,
always thought,
yeah,
and maybe the ethnomusicologists out there and the people that know all of these things, maybe they can chime in with some comments. But I just use my ears,
right,
right? And when I listen to the blues,
yeah,
especially the blues in the countryside, in
right,
the out of the way lands,
right.
you hear this kind of right pentatonic
Oh yeah,
descent from
yeah,
the
yeah, yeah,
top,
yeah.
right? which everybody people say, well, that comes from the Sudanic regions of Africa and the West African griots and all of this stuff, and that is true.
Right.
I do not deny that. I
Right.
can hear when I hear those musics also in Africa, and in West Africa and in the Sudan region. You hear these things, right?
Right.
Also true that people in Africa are learning American music and African American music.
Yeah.
That's another. That's another. And Cuban music.
Yeah.
You'd be surprised, like how much Cuban music went from Cuba, and then Africans
Yeah.
started learning their
Yeah.
their version of Cuban music. So
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
that's fascinating. But it's beside the point. What I was gonna say is that, man, when I hear like Native Americans,
Mm-hmm.
you know, do their music and their spiritual, the with the chants and all of that stuff and the drums, and I hear a similar
Oh yeah.
kind of descent. I
Oh yeah.
hear it,
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
you
There you
hear
go.
that,
Yeah.
and
Yeah. This.
I just wonder, man, could it be possible that this thing is also in the blues, that
Oh yeah.
it's not just from one place?
Yeah, no, it's well documented actually, because we have this one person, just like you know we have like always these one people who sort of spark, or
It's always
like,
one. It's always
in
one that starts
exactly
trouble.
in so we have at least documentation about this one dude by the name of Charlie Patton. And Charlie Patton was a crow, came from an area in the US. He was a black man, came from an area in the US where there are Crow Indians, right? um,
Mm,
and the way he sings, the little bit of documentation that we have, is almost identical to Native American singing, right? The way he plays the guitar, and he was a blues musician, country blues musician, and he influenced a lot of people, including Jimi Hendrix, including
mm,
because understand, like all of these, aside from the realization that uh, a sort of deep dive into these topics always means realizing that there has been significant resistance, right?
exactly. That's
That
what
is
I was
one
going to
thing.
say.
One thing. The other realization is that all of these people who influence, all of these musicians, very famous musicians, or people who have influenced people, have influenced the rest of us, right? They did their homework. They didn't
Hmm.
leave anything up for chance. They did their homework. Jimi Hendrix knew about Charlie Patton, knew about T-Bone Walker, right? And
Hmm.
like took the lineage from these players. Knew, of course, Robert Johnson, knew about all of these people, right? So Charlie Patton, when you hear his music, it sounds very, very, very much Native American influenced, right? There is
Yeah.
in both of the videos for the bass chat, I referenced the movie Rumble, right? The Indians that rock the world, and they have a big, big part on Charlie Patton. And they play his music to members of this group by the name of Ulali, either
Mhm.
Ulali or Ulani, which is a female a cappella vocal group, right? Consists of four or three ladies who are singing Native American songs today, and who
Hmm.
kind of bring it into the contemporary. And sure enough, they are playing Charlie Patton to them, and they're like, "Yeah, that's Indian music."
Wow.
That's a scene in the movie. Like, there's just there's no editing, no nothing. This just happened like right there as they were filming the movie. The lady was, like, "Yeah, that's Indian. Sounds like Indian music to me."
Wow, that's heavy.
It's
And
so
and I
deep.
yeah, it is I suppose that there's a lot of that.
Yeah,
There's a lot because everything comes from something,
yeah,
and sometimes in an effort to describe something really well, we forget
yeah,
that, like, the branches,
yeah.
we forget, like, branches that come before the branches that we're talking about.
Oh yeah, oh yeah, 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 yeah. We
You
forget
see, like,
the
in a
roots.
time before Native Americans were all in reservations, or in a time before smallpox killed a bunch of people,
Right.
Native American people in a time where there was trade and I mean there was
Yeah.
cultural exchange. There
Yeah.
was culture. There was people singing and people. And I imagine that in a dominant culture of, like, in the case of the United States, of white Protestant kind of aesthetics, and to have this alternative
Yeah.
view of the world, both spiritually and cosmically,
Yeah.
to have that available to you in the case of the Native Americans, for people that were enslaved and their descendants, that could have been
Hmm.
a way of breaking away from this more kind of a normalized existence of
Right.
Protestantism
Right.
in America.
Right.
And I mean, I'm only speculating, and
Yeah.
I can only say, but we know of plenty of communities of Native Americans that accepted uh, enslaved people that had escaped
Right. Right.
their enslavement.
Right.
So I imagine that that could have happened in all sorts of places,
Yeah.
from the Caribbean all the way down to Patagonia and all the way up to the north.
Yeah, and it did, and it undoubtedly did. Also, there's plenty of documentation of that. There's plenty of evidence. There is. Look at our show. Look at Ain't Too Proud. The bass player James Jameson. He came from South Carolina, from an area that is inhabited by the Gullah Geechee people, Gullah slash
Hmm.
Geechee people, and those were, either runaway slaves or people who were freed, and they ended up living on the land, and they continued their culture, their West African culture, together with the native people that were already there, right? Jameson is one of the descendants of those people.
Wow,
Now,
that's amazing.
if you think about, like, think the music before Jameson and the music after Jameson, right? There
Right.
is a discernible change, right?
Hmm.
That he sparked, that he started, because nobody played like him, and he became he became the sound of Motown, right?
Hmm.
He became sound, and then Motown again changed everything for everybody else, right?
Hmm.
So the influence of that particular culture, you cannot deny it. It's everywhere, but you have to be able to recognize it, and you have to be able to recognize it in bits and pieces that are perhaps not clearly visible, right? That
Right. You
are
have to look for the signs. You have to be
exactly.
able to read the signs and be able to understand the context
Yeah,
in which culture is forged and how things happen,
exactly.
how things come, like when people see, like, speaking of spirituality, when people see, like, the Virgin of Guadalupe in
Right,
Mexico, right?
right,
They'd be like, oh, well, that's Christianity,
right,
that's it's but okay, well, it's Christianity, but who was the person that had the vision? Oh,
right,
it was the native Mexican.
right.
And who are the people interpreting what the native Mexicans saw? You
Yeah,
know what I mean?
yeah, yeah,
And what is it that he saw? And I mean, and I don't want to say that it's not the Holy Virgin of Guadalupe. It probably is.
yeah,
But the symbology and the iconography
yeah,
of this image
yeah,
is clearly very heavily influenced by native Mexican uh, iconography and art and
yeah.
all of that, and that's one of the symbols
Right,
of Mexico.
right,
And
right,
yeah, of course, it is also a symbol of Christianity in Mexico.
right.
But besides that, there's all of these other elements that make it up.
Oh
I
yeah,
mean, just like when you go to Europe and early Christianity in Europe, there's all of these pagan elements that are making up
oh yeah,
this early Christianity in Europe. It's not just straight up Christianity. I mean, you
yeah.
can tell that the Germans didn't continue their way of worshiping while
No, it's the same.
Christianity was in Germany,
Yeah, totally, totally. No, it's the same. I mean, that it's not only early Christianity. It's
It's
current
now Christianity.
it's contemporary Christianity. I mean,
Yeah.
growing up in Austria, we have around this right now, we are in December of 2020. Now it's December 13th, so we're a couple of days past this particular event. But in Catholicism, you have on December 6th, I believe, you have Saint Nicholas arriving, and Saint
Mm,
Nicholas brings gifts for the kids who were good that year, right?
mhm,
On December 5th, though, you have somebody arriving by the name of Krampus. Krampus
mm.
is St. Nicholas' aide, he's his helper who deals with the bad kids, right?
Okay. He got
And
stuck with the trouble
Kramp
killer.
exactly like me, right?
Like,
So Krampus comes, in Austrian belief, in Austrian pagan belief, he comes from the mountains because Austria is 75% alpine. He comes
mm,
from the mountains, and the way he's depicted, he's got like a terrible face, tongue hanging out, he's got horns, right? He's like, he's a demon basically,
straight up,
straight up pagan demon
right,
who
right.
has become the aid to the ultra Catholic Saint Nicholas.
Right. A very uneasy relationship.
Yeah, they somehow they managed to work it out.
A truce of sorts.
But all this to say that, of course, Catholicism has included pagan beliefs. So just
Right,
like the Virgin of Guadalupe, no doubt that there is, the introduction of a native belief, and that gets absorbed into Catholicism,
right,
right?
right,
Um,
right,
and again, like it's the same argument that can and is being made that enslaved people who freed themselves or who were freed, went they couldn't necessarily go back to Africa, right?
right,
But
right,
they found tribal communities, tribal societies that had the same structure and partially very, very similar cultures to what they were used to. And of
right,
course, they ended up being in those societies, in those cultures. And out of all of that, out of that melange, out of that mixture, you have what we understand today as Native American
right,
culture, society, whatever it might be,
right.
and that influenced the culture and our what I call our collective consciousness,
Hmm,
right?
hmm.
So that was kind of the idea behind all of that, and what you brought today, is so important because all of a sudden there are these instruments, and check this out.
The proof, it's right here.
There you go. That
This
you
one is
can.
from Peru. This is a Peruvian rattle,
Okay.
and I mean, it's I guess musicologists call these things idiophones
Okay.
because they make a noise, a
Right.
sound from their bodies as opposed to a drum, which has like a membrane, and
Right. 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 Right.
um, but yeah, I mean, you just got to look at the signs, George. I mean, they're there.
Exactly. Yeah.
They're there. And
Yeah.
I mean, this is like a 500, at least 500-year-old history.
Right.
And it keeps going.
Right.
It just
Yeah.
doesn't stop because we write a book or we make a movie or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
It just keeps going.
Listen to Heard It Through the Grapevine, Marvin Gaye, right?
Hmm.
The beginning of that is dum 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 dum. Where the hell do you think those drums came from?
Right. Right,
Those are
right, right.
those are war drums. There is
Right,
there's no two ways about that. That there
right,
is no it's not just like, okay, well, I'm gonna play four on the on the
right,
floor tom, and I'm gonna accentuate the very first one. There's a reason why this stuff is there, right?
right,
There's a reason. There's thought that went into it, and there's a connection that is being made. So, and that was really the sort of the underlying idea behind the videos that I put up, and why I'm having you here today. So,
well, I'm
Javi,
honored and I'm thankful.
listen, the honor and the grateful, the thankfulness is all mine. So I don't want to keep you any longer. It was so great to see you again and talk to you. and get this firsthand introduction or firsthand documentation of what these instruments really look like, and kind of at least hopefully spark uh, the idea of recognizing cultural influence, with the people who are listening this and who are watching these videos. And people are watching them. I'm surprised, but
Oh yeah,
people are really into it. I mean, we're in a pandemic, so what are you gonna do, I guess? But it is an interesting topic, and it definitely influences how you approach this music, and
for
understand where it's
sure. I
coming
mean,
from.
this and look, I mean, this is an ongoing process.
Hmm.
Besides being a performer, and I'm also an educator, and
Right,
I'm constantly reminding those that want to hear
right,
that music, that there isn't one music. Like when
right,
we talk about music, when we
right,
say uh, music theory,
right,
everybody is talking about really white European music theory.
right. That's
Nobody
correct.
is thinking about African music theory
Right.
or
Yeah.
Indian music theory, or they're just thinking about that particular brand of music theory. Similarly, when we say music,
Right.
and when people say the great masters of music, when you're a little kid,
Right.
oh, these are the great masters of music.
Right.
The faces that you see are all of these composers, all from Europe,
Right.
all male, all white,
Yeah.
and all dead. so, so and that's, as an educator, I want to try to always make people understand that music doesn't exist
Mm.
ever.
Right.
Music has to be made on the spot.
Right.
So even if you're Beethoven and you wrote the Ninth Symphony, somebody has to come up and play it. It's
Yes.
not going to play itself.
Right.
Even
Right.
if
It's
you
it's
record an album, somebody's going to have to listen to it.
yeah.
So music has to be created, and in that sense, music is always an aspect of the present,
Right.
of now.
Right. Right.
But it connects us, like what we're trying to do here, with all of these influences from the past, and it's
Right.
always there. The line is unbroken, and it's there for those that want to see it. And
Right.
it's a multicultural line,
Yeah.
it's a multiracial line, and it's a line controlled by histories that have harsh realities that you
Yeah.
have to understand, accept,
Yeah.
acknowledge,
Yeah.
and then you're able to know what is happening with the music.
I couldn't say it any better. The professor has spoken. I'm like, yes. Awesome, Javi. Listen, thank you so much. It's been awesome, and perhaps if I can think of another subject, I will call you and we'll have another conversation.
You know where to find me. I'm
Yes,
here.
awesome. You take
George,
it
thank you
easy.
so much. Thank you, man. Thank
Of
you.
course, of course, of course.